Are You Ever Going to Put Me Down? By Matthew Revert. I'm not a romantic man. Hell, I'm barely even an adequate man. Still, I met a girl who, despite looking like a bag of shrimp, became my wife. She was a good woman, still is in fact. I met her at a rope convention. I was a patron and she manned a vendor's stand. She represented a company that flogged rope stiffeners for snake charmers. I wasn't a snake charmer, but I looked like one, so she approached me with hands slathered in stiffener. Something about her caught my attention. Perhaps it was the way she spat when she talked, or the hair that exploded in glamorous tufts from her cleavage. It's hard to say. All I knew was that I'd grown smitten. We immediately participated in several unsatisfactory sexual encounters, decided we were perfect for each other, and married the following week. The wedding was memorable in that we both died several times throughout the ceremony. We were resuscitated by a kind child who happened to be attempting to seduce a nearby bridesmaid. His technique was sloppy, but he got our lungs heaving again. As husband and wife, we were satisfactory. Each Tuesday night we'd pretend we knew how to play canasta. Afterwards, she'd begrudgingly allow me to have sex with her anus. This continued for several years without major deviation. Life was good in that it wasn't especially challenging. The complaints started to occur soon after our 10th anniversary. I remember the first complaint well. We were out and about collecting children for a lady who lived next door. She paid us $5 a head, so we were more than happy to oblige. A ferocious storm struck. Mutilated frogs and bashful wrens rained down around and upon us. The storm was too heavy to partake in playful frolics. Our minds were set on the dry environs of home. The only thing standing in our way was an impressive puddle. "Carry me across, darling," she said. I stared at her and then the puddle. Weighing up the pros and cons, I eventually shook my head in refusal. She appeared to accept my response without too much drama and made her way toward the puddle. The second the puddle felt the kiss of her foot, it sucked her right down. She was flailing like a sack of exorcisms. I could see she was drowning and, being her husband, decided to help her. I snatched a walking stick from an old man and hooked it around the crotch of my wife's underpants. I dragged her to shore and jumped on her gut a bit, until anything she'd swallowed came out. This is how I found my Game Boy. Things were icy that night. She came out of the coma and refused to talk to me. I buttered her up with some jokes about genitals, and eventually she emerged from her shell. "Why didn't you carry me?" she said. "You looked a bit heavy," I replied. "But you've never carried me." I wasn't aware this was an issue. "I didn't think it was, and then I nearly drowned." "You did drown. Drowning doesn't have to result in death." "That's not the point." "Then what's the point?" "You never carry me." She rolled over, avoiding me for the rest of the night. There's something about being ignored that compels one to ponder. She was right. Never in my life had I carried my wife anywhere. Not to bed, not across the threshold of our first home, and not out of the McKinley fire, and certainly not across the puddle that nearly killed her. Was it the duty of man to physically carry his woman? Was it the desire of the woman to be carried by her man? Inadequacy reverberated within me. I'd never questioned my masculinity before this day. What kind of man was I to have never carried his wife? A masculine instinct took over my body, suppressing all logic. I approached my wife, who was sleeping like a dead manatee on the hospital bed. I scooped my arms beneath her and picked her up. She's not a skinny woman, and her weight was a difficult thing for my arms to comprehend. IVs and catheter tubes snapped free as I moved her away from the bed. Having become disconnected, the heart monitor she was attached to barked like a digital dog. Nurses wafted into the room like a silent fart. With my wife awkwardly cradled in my arms, I turned to face them. "I'm awfully sorry," I said. "This is something I simply must do. I'd appreciate it if you moved aside." The nurses talked amongst themselves for a while, like bad turkey impersonations. They chose a representative who said, "Please leave. You strike us as a good man." I nodded my sincere thanks and began slowly walking toward the hospital exit, carrying my wife proudly. Doctors, nurses, and patients formed a guard of honor up and down the hospital corridors and slowly clapped in appreciation as we left. All I could think, as the outside air pissed all over us, was, I'm doing the right thing. My wife awoke about 30 minutes into my aimless walk. She stared at me with the blank expression of a politician. I smiled down at her, flashing all 5 of my teeth. Your dreams come true today, my sweet, I said in a whisper. As the situation began to dwell on her, she kicked her legs and whimpered. This made it difficult to keep my grip firm, but I persevered. What are you doing? She said. Don't fight it, you were right. A woman deserves to be carried by her man. Put me down, she screamed. Not on your life. I have a lot of making up to do. Are you hungry? She didn't answer me straight away, which was somewhat bothersome as I was growing rather famished. I kept quiet though. This was all about her and I didn't want to interfere with my petty wants. I endured her escalating screams, knowing they couldn't last forever. With her mouth open as it was, she already swallowed several bats, and I knew her threshold was approaching. Eventually she quietened down and said, Yes, I'm hungry. It took a little longer than I'd hoped to arrive at the nearest convenience store. Having another person weigh you down understandably slows your pace. We approached the stark fluorescence of the store and I maneuvered us inside. Patrons stared at us in awe. A unibrowed child approached us and asked, Is it okay if I get on too, sir? I assessed the situation. He was a small lad, so I didn't assume his added weight would affect us too much. I'm quite all right with it. However, I must seek the permission of a guardian. I wouldn't want anyone to think I was kidnapping you. Dad! The child yelled. From within a freezer emerged a charming-looking sort. His hair was brilled back and his jaundiced complexion shimmered in the bright light. Are you this scamp's guardian? I asked. I most certainly am, he replied. Your boy, he'd like to join my wife and I. Would you object to this? He stared at his son with folded arms. His son stared back in anticipation. If you think you can handle the extra load, I'm more than happy with the proposal. The child jumped about. Liquid excitement seeped through the crotch of his pants. Are you sure about this? Asked my wife. Quite sure. Pop aboard, my good man. He mounted my wife like playground apparatus. The sudden increase in weight came close to toppling us. After a brief adjustment, we were ready. Some food, please, I called to the shopkeep. Within seconds he handed over a large flask of gravy, which the 3 of us took turns suckling upon. Although my arms ached like broken hearts, I felt full of life. We had been travelling around for quite some time. A sizable procession of individuals now followed us, and news helicopters hovered overhead. My wife was largely silent, and the child sat atop her like a throned king. He made up for her seeming lack of enthusiasm. There's just one thing I'd like to know, she eventually said. What's that, my sweet? Are you ever going to put me down? I had no immediate answer. I simply hadn't planned that far ahead. I was involved in what was perhaps my first grandiose gesture. I hadn't yet developed a blueprint. I'm not really sure, I said honestly. She breathed deeply. In that case, I have one request. Of course, dear. Anything you desire. I want this day to be as perfect as possible. I want the cat. This didn't come as a surprise. The cat and she had been partners in crime ever since she gave birth to it as a dare. The added weight would be minuscule, and if the child was willing to keep the cat under control, I saw no issue with it. I turned toward home and began my slow, stumbling walk. The growing crowds and helicopters reoriented themselves and continued to follow. A reporter riding a penny farthing slowed down beside us. He retrieved a microphone and jutted it toward me. What are you doing? He asked. Popping back home to pick up the cat, I replied. And, this cat, is it a good one? You'd have to ask my wife, I said with a chuckle. The reporter repositioned the microphone and repeated the question to my wife. She didn't respond.